Something is quite missing on this channel. It is something that I've previously talked about, but it has taken a bit of a hiatus at the moment. Today we're going to take a dive into the world of politics regarding Russia.
In America, you watch TV.
Yeah, punch him in the dick!
Soviet Russia, TV watches you.
Trust, this is kinda weird. Stop looking at me!
I know it's been a while since I've talked about the relationship between Russia and the West, but I've been sidetracked as my professional life is killing me at the moment. I'm also working on marketing my book, and I'm trying to work out something with possible future misses. However, one thing inspired me to come back to the topic as I was rewatching the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. It does have some inaccuracies, but the show is quite good. Now, that's one thing that I forgot to put in my previous video, but in case you don't know, the Kremlin rebuked against the show for its portrayal of the Soviet Union. As a response, they're making their own movie, which will show their version of the story. And at the very core of the movie will be about how the CIA caused the disaster by sabotaging the Chernobyl power plant. But that also got me back to some history, as I absolutely love history. Yet, I wanted to experience the video wars that the two Chernobyl stories had here on YouTube, and my lovely compatriot today is this video. A place where we will receive some biased history lessons. Considering that subliminal messages like this one are frequent throughout the YouTube platform, I've decided to come across my own. The Cold War was definitely a changing moment in history, and it is true that both the US and USSR did some evil things during this period. But Vicky's video here has some oopsies, and I'd like to point them out. But I just need to make this one thing. His video is 21 minutes long, and it has a lot of oopsies. So if I actually put all of them, this video would be about an hour and a half long. So I'm actually going to talk about this in different videos. So he starts with the history of the world from the pre-war era to modern times. Let's go through the entire video piece by piece and point out the oopsies.
In Europe, the capitalist nations and the Soviet Union met in order to discuss how to prevent another European war and how to rebuild the destroyed continent. They couldn't agree on anything, most importantly what economic system the continent should follow, so they decided to split the continent up and figure it out later.
For the first point, I have to make a correction here. He is talking about the Yalta Conference, which was in February of 1945. It was not after World War II. And the economic systems actually weren't that big of a topic of discussion. The West and the Soviets didn't trust each other during the World War II, which is why the Allies even planned Operation Unthinkable. It was never going to go good from the start.
Western nations, the free market was instituted and quickly did absolutely nothing.
I wonder how that did absolutely nothing. The Marshall Plan was very successful. Western European countries experienced a rise in their GDP by 15 to 25%. It also greatly contributed to the rapid renewal of Western European chemical, engineering, and steel industries. Several nations, even of the Eastern Bloc, also applied for the Marshall Plan, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, but they were pressured by the Soviets to opt out. I'm curious to know how it accomplished nothing.
To be more specific, capitalist nations were given US dollars, which had to be used on imports. I wonder what kind of country had an export-oriented economy which wasn't damaged in a war and which accepted US dollars.
And this is not true. The US did receive some damage during the war on its own soil. Pearl Harbor and its surroundings were hit, and the Japanese invaded Alaska during the Aleutian Islands campaign. There was also the shelling of Fort Stevens in Washington, the Battle of Los Angeles, the bombing of Elwood in California, and U-boat activity in the Mississippi River. Yeah, time to do some more research.
Well, so essentially the US government was giving money to their friends which they then had to spend on US goods. In addition to this, much of the industry of Western capitalist nations was bought up or indebted to American capitalists and banks, who loaned money to the rebuilding continent. On top of that, the USA used the political leverage they got from the Marshall Plan to influence the elections in nations they occupied. towards liberal free market economies. Essentially, the Western European nations were turned into economic colonies or puppet states of the US.
Oh, is that so? This is what I said in a previous video. I would like to point out how exactly the countries I'm citizens of are basically puppet states of the US. Because in the majority of cases, other Western countries have their own policies separate from the US. Every other nation in the West has socialized services such as universal healthcare and many other things that Americans would consider communist. In the early 1970s, Western Europe, for example, did not support the Greek junta in Cyprus, while the US very much did. Canada, for example, refused to go to Vietnam, something that caused some tension between the US and Canada. France withdrew from the Joint Allied Command structure in NATO in 1968. Austria became a neutral but capitalist country during the Cold War. The remaining Western nations disagreed with the US on a lot of things. Let's not forget that the Soviets also rigged a lot of elections of their own in the Eastern Bloc, such as the 1947 Polish legislative election where anti-communists were persecuted. And whenever the Warsaw Pact nations disagreed with the Soviet Union, Moscow didn't take it too kindly. Like, they invaded Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in 1971. So I have to ask, between the two sides, who had it better?
Pretty much all natural resources and industry of Germany are located here, outside of the Soviet zone. This was seen as an injustice as the USSR had lost most blood in defeating fascism, and it felt like it deserved a richer area to pay reparations. The only industrial region of the Soviet occupation zone was Berlin, and Stalin demanded all of it so they may pay reparations.
And here it is, people, the very common argument that Soviet lovers just love. Even the guy I previously did a video on basically said the same thing. The whole geography and access to natural resources argument can easily be struck down. For example, one of the best agricultural regions, which is also known as the breadbasket region, was mostly in the area which ended up in Poland when the borders were drawn. Also, it's fair to know that Germany has always had a decentralized structure, and wealth was always spread out. Then let's take into account that Saxony was one of the richest areas in Germany back then due to Meissen being located there. And he's wrong. East Germany did have its own railroad industrial section. The main train production facilities were in Görlitz, which is in the east. The center of publishing was also in Leipzig, and a large number of chemical plants were in Bitterfeld. Then you also have to add to the fact that the optic industry was also in the east in Jena. The east also had its own coal industry in Oberlausitz, and on top of that, East Germany had access to the sea. It basically had everything it needed to function as a country and more.
On a strategic level, Europe was now divided and the capitalists were gearing for war.
Yeah. Only the West was gearing for war.
Meanwhile, in the United States, everyone who was a communist or a suspected communist was fired, arrested, and worse, in what's known as the McCarthy era. Throughout this, the United States still claimed to support freedom of expression.
Yeah, and in the Soviet Union, there were massive purges, as anyone who criticized the state were killed in the most brutal ways possible. Practicing a religion was illegal. Attempting to leave the state would land you in a gulag. Resisting party doctrine would send you to a gulag. The list goes on.
Then, in order to totally not escalate the Cold War, the capitalist nations banded together and formed NATO, an aggressive military alliance designed to threaten the Soviet Union and contain the revolution.
Oh yeah, branding together to be ready to defend against a madman who always threatened to swallow up the world is very aggressive.
Let's have a look at China. It was in a civil war. The main factions were the Communist People's Liberation Army under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the practically fascist Chinese Nationalist Party under the leadership of some fascist guy, I don't know, you won't remember the name anyway. They have been fighting since before World War II, then stopped when the Japanese showed up and started doing genocide, and right after the Japanese had surrendered, they were at each other's throats again. Long story short, the communists win and the nationalists have to go on this island, and they pretend to be the real China until this day, though nobody takes them seriously.
For starters, the leader was called Chiang Kai-shek. Second of all, is every enemy of communism a fascist? Seriously, people still have this mentality now. But I think it's time we talked about the status of China, and I have to say it right now. The Kuomintang Government, which led the Republic of China, was democratically elected. In 1927, when the Chinese Civil War began, the communists started the uprising at Wuhan, yes, the city where this started. And then it spread quickly to other cities in China. Didn't Vicky advocate for democratic elections early in the video, as they would solidify a government as legitimate?
The capitalist nations, he wanted to create a unified democratic Germany with international supervision. The Western nations declined this offer because they were afraid that the large socialist population in Germany may democratically vote to become socialist. And we all know that the problem with democracy is that sometimes the people vote differently from how you want them to.
Then why is he recognizing a party that overthrew an existing government as legitimate? Technically, Taiwan is the legitimate China, as they were democratically elected in 1912. After that, he moves on to Korea, which is the second proxy war of the Cold War, not the first, and I made a video on the Korean War. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. But Vicky really does outdo it and spends very little time on the Korean War because he knows there is not a lot of room to make the Soviet Union look good.
In Korea, both the USA and USSR had installed temporary local leaders, which acted as placeholders until the peninsula would be united again. But after the capitalist nations had made it clear that the united Germany would not happen unless the Soviet Union agreed that it would be a capitalist state, the government in North Korea became a bit anxious. It was a socialist government backed by the USSR. The South was seen as occupied territory by the North, especially as the fascist capitalist government there was close friends with and funded by the American government. The Southern government committed many war crimes against suspected communists, often under the direction of US troops.
Are you seriously going to claim that North Korea, a country that has always had some of the worst human rights violations in history, has not committed any crimes against the South during this time? Are you that much of a supporter of communism?
When you have 2 diamonds in Minecraft, but your friend has 4. We need communism.
By 1950, the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung decided to put an end to the fascists and started a liberation war against the dictatorship. When almost the entire peninsula was liberated, many capitalist nations came to support the fascist dictatorship.
And he forgot to mention that Kim Il-sung's military was actually under the command of the Soviet Red Army at that time. If Kim Il-sung wanted to go to war, he had to have permission from the Kremlin first. So the start of the Korean War was pretty much the Soviet Union's bidding. Isn't it ironic that whenever communists invade another country, it's liberating, but whenever everyone else invades it, it's a violation of international law? Gotta love Stalinist populism.
The effort of half of the world was not in vain, and the North Korean army was pushed back. Fearing that the capitalists might just keep going and invade Manchuria after they were done with Korea, Chairman Mao Zedong decided to send support to Korea. That support came in the form of 500,000 soldiers. The US general wanted to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the president refused because of the fear that the Soviet Union might intervene and use their own nuclear weapons as well.
The Soviet Union did intervene in the Korean War, as neither China nor North Korea had fighter jets to fight the UN jets. Someone had to fly the MiG-15, which was the only plane good enough to fight in the war, and there was not enough time to train the communist East Asians. That's why the Soviet Union secretly entered the Korean War only 10 days after the Chinese, as they provided air cover and anti-aircraft fire. Russia itself even admitted this after the fall of the Soviet Union and even made a documentary about the Soviet troops who fought in the Korean War in 2015.
After 3 years, the fronts were back to where they were before, and the Korean government agreed on an armistice which is in power until today. The South Korean people suffered under a series of US-backed fascist dictatorships until 1987, when they moved to a neoliberal democracy.
Yeah, lovely. The South Korean people suffered. I'll let my friend Emma Blackberry explain what went on in North Korea after the Korean War.
During his 46-year rule over North Korea, Kim Il-sung established a cult of personality, erecting statues of himself across the country and brainwashing his citizens to essentially treat him as a godlike figure. Those who opposed him were either sentenced to death by execution or sent to prison camps, with both methods of punishment still reportedly being used in the country today. I say reportedly because North Korea has consistently denied the existence of these prison camps, and I'm not about to get shot. The North attempted and failed several assassination attempts of members of the South Korean government. But surprisingly, due to a massive focus on industrial production, the North Korean economy started to recover quite quickly from the war. And until the 1960s, the growth was higher there than in the south. In 1956, leader Kim Il-sung developed Juche, which is still the official political ideology of North Korea to this day. Essentially translating to self-reliance, Juche encourages the state as a whole and each individual citizen to be the masters of their own destiny and not relying on other states politically or monetarily.
Notice how he spent less than 90 seconds talking about the Korean War, because if he did, he would have to say a lot of not so nice things about the three godfathers of communism in the early years of the Cold War. So I apologize for taking too long to make this video, because this one took a lot of time to make as expected. It will continue on with part 2. Next time we will talk more about the division of Germany, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the space race.